Good morning, and thank you for the privilege and the honor to spend some time sharing some ideas about where MOOCs started, what happened, and where they should go. I particularly appreciated the Vice President's comments on the need for education to change and become something different than what it is today. There's a few slides I'll go through quickly. I had deleted a few slides, but they didn't make the deck. So if I flip through, I'll share the full slide deck after the event. But for now, just for the sake of time, there's a few that I'll move through quickly. So I'll begin with four things. I want to talk about where I started with MOOCs, what my original goal was, then what happened, and what we should have done differently, and where I think we need to go. So MOOCs are not completely new by themselves. MOOCs are part of a long history of universities trying to serve society by improving the access that individuals have to education. And this goes back to open education resources, to open universities such as the Open University UK. It also goes to the open source software movement that underpins much of today's internet. And then in 2008, I was at University of Manitoba, and I'll talk about that a little bit. I started with a colleague, Stephen Downs, an open online course. For a period of time, I ran about 6 different MOOCs on topics of connectivism, connected learning, learning analytics. But then in 2011, there was an initiative at Stanford where they ran a large MOOC that had several 100,000 students, and that resulted ultimately in the development of a number of MOOC providers. The only one, I'll say, that's largely stayed to that original theme of serving society while innovating in education has been edX. As I'll talk later, Udacity, Coursera, and others have largely shifted to corporate learning. So when we start, whoa, that went the wrong way. Let me try it this way. There we go. So the first course was in 2008 called Connectivism and Connective Learning. And the goal that I had with this course, this is the model that many of us experience in university, and this is what the Vice President talked about in his insightful comments, which is you have a teacher that teaches content and the student learns it. The teacher's in control, it's not focused on the student. What we wanted was a model that was more of a network rather than sort of a vertical relationship. We wanted students to learn the way that the internet works, where you can connect and access information and ideas from people from around the world. In particular, we wanted to do 2 things. We wanted to still retain the structure of learning that students are familiar with today, namely a lecture, an activity, assessment, and then a credential. But we wanted to start the process of moving students to networks and to connective learning. You can't change a complete system by flipping a switch overnight. The faculty, the students, and the university system needs to absorb the changes of the network before it can work like a network. And I'll talk about that in a little bit. So we started by asking our students to learn wherever they wanted to. So they could learn, at that point we used Moodle, which is an open source learning management system. We said they could use blogs, they could use Twitter, they could use any type of platform that they wanted. If it output a small RSS file, then we would scrape all of those sources and we would pull them together. So what networks do, what technology does, is it creates fragmentation. It takes pieces and breaks them, or a whole piece and makes them smaller. The difficulty with that is that learning is an experience of coherence forming. And what that means is that we need to pull all of these pieces together so that it means something. And that's the role of a university in a networked age. It's realizing that students are learning everywhere on many different platforms, and our responsibility is to try and pull it together into something that's a reasonably sophisticated whole, so that the pieces connect properly. And that's what we did with our first MOOC, was students would participate in any of the spaces they were interested, and then we would filter the results and put out a daily email that pulled together the conversation from thousands of students in one central space. Now what happened was a little different though. So we kept running these socially oriented, networked courses that were intended to develop self-regulated learning skills in the student. Our vision was that the student is the center of the future of learning, and that the student needs to develop skills to continue to learn even when the teacher is gone. And so that was our vision. But a number of initiatives, namely early with Coursera and Udacity, got attention from media that very aggressively promoted everything was new, everything was different. And this wasn't true, because universities serve a vital role in society, and you can't just completely change a system. If you're familiar with how complex adaptive systems operate in learning, you know that even if you change one part, that doesn't change the whole. So even if you start moving content online, that doesn't change the social responsibility of universities, the role that universities play in research and knowledge advancement and so on. But in the US at least, there was a lot of hype. There was a lot of interest with higher education is now disruptive, MOOCs are going to change the world. One of the early groups that ran out of Stanford said that in the future, there would only be 10 universities, and Udacity would be one of those 10. In spite of that hype, in a period of just a few years, MOOCs had developed to be quite globally represented. So MOOCs and MOOC providers were starting to come out in all parts of the world and giving access to, by today, hundreds of millions of students learning in this environment. But early on, there was a big question that many people worried about, which was there was a high dropout rate, which meant that it was easy for students to sign up, but many of these students dropped out quickly. And that's a significant challenge, or at least we thought it was at the time. It isn't a challenge, because one of the important things with open education, and I'll address this in a few slides, is that it serves a market that traditional universities had not been paying attention to. So then we had a lot of reports once we've heard about how the university dropout rates were so high in MOOCs. We had a lot of reports that came out that said, guess what, MOOCs are dead. They don't work, they're broken. MOOCs aren't the thing that we thought they would be. Even Udacity, which was going to be one of the 10 MOOCs of the future, decided that they were dead, and they admitted that they have a lousy product. And all of a sudden, we had a lot of media attention saying that MOOCs were no longer relevant. And this went on from one press coverage to another press coverage. We started looking at some of the article counts that were being reflected, and it also indicated this drop in rates. So we looked at the number of articles by different quartiles that were published that included some reference to MOOCs. And so we looked at the major publications from around the world, and it showed that we really peaked in the third and fourth quarter of 2013 with public MOOC hype by media attention. And the resources that we looked at were some of the prominent media outlets that in many cases would have between 100 and 200 publications in MOOCs over a very short period of time. But the coverage of these dropped very quickly, and so it was MOOCs were a short fad in the eyes of media that very quickly started to drop. But those numbers are very different now. So even though they say MOOCs are dead, the numbers are completely opposite to that. They show that MOOCs are growing at an extremely rapid rate, This number is actually a little bit off. It's closer to probably 150 to 200 million students with the different types of MOOCs that are now offered. And it gave an opportunity for universities to stop and think about whether the way that they were teaching was the way that they should be teaching. It put a lot of, MOOCs gave universities an opportunity to ask questions about, are we serving the modern student? If you think of it, universities were designed before the internet, before digital knowledge, before many of the technologies that exist today. And as a result of that, they served a need for a student that doesn't exist anymore. And so as a result of that, even though there's been massive increase and massive growth in the number of students that are taking MOOCs, universities are only at the early stages of starting to understand what MOOCs mean. And I'll put this in the language of economics. MOOCs are a supply-side answer to decades of demand-side increase in learning needs. So what I mean with that, we need to learn more, and we need to learn more constantly. But universities still serve the traditional student in the traditional way. So here's a few things that we should have done, and just a couple of quick points. So with the Research Center, I'm at the Center for Change and Complexity in Learning out of Australia, and the Learning Innovation Lab at University of Texas. We focus our research on projects that advance basic knowledge and that also have a practical impact on the university. A lot of the early research in MOOCs was driven by computer scientists that wanted to understand small-scale interactions. Our argument is, and this is known in the literature as Pasteur's quadrant, this is research that's both innovative and fundamental to science, but has a practical impact on how an organization or a society functions. So we did a series of reports on this, and we looked at what was being done with the MOOC providers even while the attention said that it was dying and it wasn't relevant anymore. And yet most individuals that were running MOOCs were doing very important things academically. They were looking at engagement, they were looking at the design, self-regulated and social learning. They were focusing on social network analysis and network learning, and a number of factors that relate to student success, sort of the motivation and attitude that they brought with this conversation. We also focused on, and this was translated by faculty at Tsinghua University into Chinese, but this book was called Preparing for the Digital University. And so I think the big mistake that we made with MOOCs early on, and that's being corrected now, is that we didn't pay attention to the existing learning sciences and psychology and learning design literature. A lot of the attention that we had that came out of these environments was focused on trying to learn what we've already known for 30 or 40 years in a number of other domains. So that's what we should have done. So where are we going? Well, one of the biggest things, and I've already touched on this, and the Vice President addressed this in his opening comments as well, there's an entirely new learning ecology emerging. And one of two things will happen. Either this learning ecology is going to become in conflict with the university and become a separate strand of learning, or universities will recognize the trends and integrate this separate learning model into their campus practices. This is what individuals that are affiliated with MOOC providers like edX are attempting to do, meaning that they're taking the value of a new student population and trying to integrate that within the campus. This is one of the slides I'm going to skip. So a number of partnerships have been initiated that try to do this. So one way to look at MOOCs, and that I look at them more so, is that MOOCs are an opportunity for universities to experiment with the future of learning. They're an opportunity for universities to experiment with digital learning, with network learning, and with social learning. And it's an opportunity to do it in an environment that doesn't directly impact the on-classroom students, But in the next 3 to 5 years, those two will come together. Those two will merge because it makes no sense for a university to have two separate strands in this particular space. This is important for a few reasons. So I just want to talk a little bit about some of the things that are changing sort of structurally in the university system in general. So first of all, the profile of the students in many developed countries of the world have changed significantly. And this is no different in China, even though I don't have the exact statistics for this, but this is a reflection of the global economy. And what it means is that the labor market is different. The students that enter our universities are different. And the university, though, is still designed to serve a very traditional kind of population. If you look at the Mooc Takers, and this was a report that was done out of Harvard, or a few colleagues from Harvard, they looked at up to 70% of the students taking a Mooc already had a bachelor's degree, which meant that they were in industry and they were improving their learning by connecting back to the university. And this is this idea of perpetual lifelong learning, that all of us need to learn all the time. One illustration is, in the United States, the fastest growing field for employment is data science. A recent report by Kaggle in about just over a year ago stated that 59% of the people that were employed as data scientists learned their skills through a Mooc or on their own. This is a huge missed opportunity for universities, but it indicates how slow universities have been to respond to two things. One, that today's learner is different than they were 20 years ago, and two, that today's information and knowledge is different than it was 20 years ago. It's digital, it's networked, it's social, and it's global. Some universities have started to respond to this a little bit by offering certificates. Even before MOOCs, certificates were the fastest growing form of credentialing in the United States. So a lot of organizations were paying attention to this population that needs to be reskilled. In the American context, for example, and it'll be no different in China or India or any of the other major economies of the world, the next decade will see as much as 50% of the US workforce having to be reskilled. If you think about those numbers, that is trillions and trillions of dollars to re-educate a workforce. Universities, the way they're structured today, are not able to solve that need because they never paid attention to it. This is where alternative providers, such as MOOC providers or any of the other ed tech startups, come in serving that particular need. This is also reflected in granularization of assessment, meaning that a number of companies now, major organizations such as parts of IBM and major companies like PricewaterhouseCoopers, no longer require their employees, when they hire them, to have a university degree. They instead assess their competence and capabilities. This, again, is a failure on the part of universities to respond to these kinds of environments. Within our setting in the US climate, especially Coursera, which was one of the early MOOCs, and Udacity, it's all about the corporation. All of their attention has turned to serving the corporate market. And a number of these initiatives basically indicate that these are, like I said, universities will either adjust to this new reality or they will start competing with companies and organizations that have responded to this new reality. And in this case, it is universities starting to compete with organizations like Coursera for their shared client. Fortunately, there's a different approach, and this approach is something that a number of organizations have started to do by partnering and beginning to move into online environments through arrangements with organizations like edX or XuetangX. Hopefully I pronounced that sort of correctly. All right, I get 2 points. So organizations like that, the universities that begin to use these rich MOOC environments as, I think, the most important legacies of MOOCs. Those organizations that partner and learn with edX and with XuetangX are the ones that are going to have an opportunity to use that relationship to become a digital university, to become a networked university. And that, I think, is the most promising legacy of universities or organizations such as edX. This is already happening in some campuses, the forward-thinking ones. So for example, the greatest impact of a MOOC within MIT is actually on the on-classroom students. It's not just on the online environment. So it's an opportunity for us as systems to begin to implement. I'm going to skip through 3 slides because I just have a few minutes left. So one area, and I know I saw one of the gentlemen speaking later this morning, is going to be talking about artificial intelligence. I think from my interest, so with the lab that I have at University of South Australia, and I'd love to chat with anyone that's interested in these same areas, I think the single biggest problem for learning scientists, psychologists, and education researchers to address over the next 10 years, the single biggest problem is how are human beings intelligent with technology? A part of this is AI, but it's technology in general, because technology is larger than AI. So I think that's a question we need to understand, is if you look at the classical psychology definitions of learning in any introductory psychology text, that definition of learning now applies to machine learning. If you were to say learning as a sustained change in behavior, that's a process of having undergone some kind of an experience, that's the same thing that we see now with a machine learning model that explores the presence of cancer tissue in medical images, for example. So then the question becomes, what is left for the human being to do in an age where technology does many cognitive things better than human beings can do? And I think answering this is a key integrative question that, as I mentioned, psychologists and learning scientists need to answer in conjunction with organization like XuetangX and get a better sense of what that means. In the short term, though, there's a number of avenues and opportunities for machine learning and artificial intelligence in the education process that's just now starting to be deployed in a number of providers or education services. Meaning we want to better support our students by making them more creative and more innovative, and we do that by pulling back some of the more routine or mundane aspects of learning. Now I have 2.5 minutes left, so I'm going to skip these slides. Last few slides. What should a modern education system do? So a system like Tsinghua University or like University of Texas or University of Australia, where I'm affiliated, I think the core problem, like I've said, is understanding how are humans and technology intelligent together? What are the roles that each plays that requires us to be more efficient rather than to duplicate what technology does better or to duplicate what humans do better? So I think, first of all, it needs to help people to prepare to solve complex problems. This is a key research domain with the National Science Foundation out of the United States. They have a series of 10 big ideas, and one of those is on convergence. How do you bring together multiple domains of knowledge in order to solve complex problems? So you don't just have a biologist solving a complex problem. You have a biologist with a sociologist, with a psychologist, with a physicist solving complex problems. So that's the first thing a modern education system needs to do. The second thing that it needs to do is promote for lifelong learning. We've heard this for many years, but it's more and more important now. Our learning systems need to prepare us to engage in learning opportunities that run for the course of our lives. Instead of a 4-year relationship with a university, we should have a 40 or 50-year relationship with a university. And then more importantly, solve or promote holistic learning. This is learning that recognizes that cognition can be done in many cases better by a machine learning model, which means we devote more attention to affective, metacognitive, and related elements. It does require for university leadership and students to have a fundamental shift in their thinking, one that requires more recognition of ambiguity, acceptance of complexity, increasing pedagogical models that are participatory and engaged, and ultimately recognizes that we have to build a completely different technological infrastructure for learning, that our current university environment isn't complete, our current learning management systems are not complete. And there's some fundamental problems, such as developing a lifelong profile of a student, that needs to be addressed for digital learning. It's about adaptive and integrative feedback, and it's about focusing on the full scale of learners and developing the skill sets of our learners for self-regulated learning. So, thank you.